we're approaching the Feast of Trumpets, we find that's a period of time or a day or a moment of recognition where we see that God will intervene in man's affairs. In so doing, he would change and transpose the governments of man to the government of God here on earth. And I wanted to review some of the things that might signal when those changes will begin or take place. Now, in the past, the changes that we focused on were often political. What are the things that we're looking for when we're looking for, however you describe it, the end, when everything's going to go haywire? And usually when we thought that, at least in the Church of God culture, it was without the experience of what we had in 2020. It left an impression on people. It left an impression to the point that it was a little easier to understand how something could just go south real quickly. And so, what are we looking for? Are we looking for political things to take place in popular culture and in the international scene? Are we going to look at, say, an individual that may be in office that may not have the traditional composure of those before them and say, oh, the end is coming? Or will we go, Europe has but so many countries in the European Common Union. Is that it? What exactly are we looking for? In Matthew 24, we have Christ who is actually responding to such a question. And we'll get to that point later on when we touch on that question. But we look at his admonition initially. And he says in verse 42 of Matthew 24, therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. And so we're told to keep watch, but what are we watching for? Do we just have to watch CNN, Fox News, Newsmax, or whatever other company that may present itself? Social media is pretty powerful now, and you have a lot of voices there. Is that what we're watching? And in this word watch, what does that entail? Is it anything more than just staying up on the newspaper? Again, antiquated process. Nobody really reads the paper like that. But again, staying up on the news, reading social media, is that what we're watching? I contend that there's more than that to watch than just the news. That in actuality, we're to watch ourselves. Watching ourselves entails obedience to God, waiting in the process of obeying God for things to move along in the way that they're supposed to, enduring the troubles and difficulties that come from obeying God and applying the mentality that we are to be implying, aka called life, with all the struggles and problems that come with that. And so to repeat, therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. Showing watching is important. If someone is going to trash your house and break in, you're going to stay up and make sure that that doesn't happen. Many times, even in 2020, there are incidents where we had a lot of rioting in certain cities, and owners of businesses, and people in their homes, they kept watch. They stayed up. They stayed right there in the store just in case someone tried to break in. In the same way, we're supposed to keep watch, expecting Christ to come back. But again, keeping watch means Christ may come back, so try to watch all your favorite TV shows now so you can figure out what's going to happen after that cliffhanger. Because once Christ comes back, if they do stop the writer's strike, you're not going to get any more shows. That's not it. No, keeping watch is being entirely committed to obeying God and that process. And so Christ says, so you must also be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect it. He's already telling you up front, things are going to play out in a way that you don't expect. This message is going out on the heels of a question that he received, but it's being addressed to those in the church as opposed to just people at large. So what Christ is doing is more than brush your teeth before bed, eat your vegetables, and keep watch. He's not just extolling virtues. He's talking specifically to those in the church. Again, keeping watch entails obedience. It entails patiently waiting for God in that obedience. It entails endurance. The breakdown of this obedience would be all the points that are listed in Matthew 5, chapter 5 through chapter 7. All of those things encompass what obedience would be. Now, mind you, that obedience, much of it is done in secret. It's not done on a stage, or it's not supposed to be. So, this work that you're going to do, this change, this implementation of all of these qualities that are listed in Matthew 5 through Matthew 7, as we work on employing these attributes into the way that we think, the way that we reason, the way that our logic performs, and then therefore our behavior, that process happens internally. No one's looking at it. The prayer, the study, the fasting that happens at home, no one's going to see it. But what is seen are the after effects of that. And so that obedience is more than just showing up to church on Saturday. It's more than just being affiliated with a certain group. It's deeper than that. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 15. Matthew 7, verse 15. Christ says, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Their attributes, the way they're going to behave, is a testament to what and who they really are, what they're made of. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit, and Christ then goes on to talk about the consequences of that, but he first emphasizes that behavior is synonymous with what you are already working with. So the fact that he's talking about trees can put people at a disadvantage, particularly if you are not surrounded by trees. If you live in the city, or you live in an urban area, you're surrounded by concrete more so than trees. And then with our society, we go to the store to buy food. We're not going to the backyard or going out into the fields to pick fruit. And so the analogy may not hit home as much as it did with those that he was speaking to at the time. But nevertheless, it works the same way. You go to the supermarket to get fruit, and their prices are too high. You're not going to mess with that store anymore. You're going to gravitate to another store that has amenities that are more appealing to you as a customer. And hence, the store that can meet those needs, they're more in tune with what is necessary to perform in a retail fashion from provider to consumer. Likewise, as a Christian, you really want to be cognizant of who you are and what you are and how you are able to perform so that you can begin to display what it is that you are supposed to be shown. You can't put out what isn't already in. You can't take out of a checking account what you don't already have in it. Another good example would be those of sports players. And I'm talking non-professional sports. And many times you drive around in the community, you'll see people get together just to play a game. Particularly, you'll see guys get together for baseball. And they'll have the whole nine. They got all the equipment, and they got on the uniforms and such. And so they'll have these kind of organized leagues that they do. And you could have teams that, quite frankly, they stink. They're not very good. But they will go through the motions. So they'll get the new uniform and they'll be looking spiffy. And they'll have the cleats, but they don't have any skills in the game that they're playing. They'll get out on the field before the game and they'll stretch. And they'll look like, oh wow, they're really about business here with this game and how they're approaching the game. But they stink. They can't play. And it will become apparent when they hit the field that they don't have any talent, each individual player, and that they are unable to perform in the fundamental abilities that you would expect, even though they could fake it with getting the right uniform and all the things that would go along with that. The accoutrement of appearing to be a good player. The accoutrement of appearing to be a good store, and yes, not having the qualities of that. And so as a Christian, we also want to be able to display the right things. In order to do that, you have to pray, study, endure, repeat that process, and be committed to God, so that you can then take on these attributes and it will show. It would be second nature. Oftentimes in church culture, how you appear at church is one thing, but how you act at home is another. I remember when I was younger, there was a man that he was a speaker, and he was pretty prominent in the church. And as a young man, I'm thinking, we all about business. We all about God's business. And I remember talking to one of his daughters. I'm still under this perception that this is what we're all doing. And as I'm speaking to her, she's like, my parents are never home. I'm like, what? What kind of life is that? What do you mean they're never home? And as I spoke to her, it was all facade. What was being shown oftentimes on Saturdays. That won't work. That's not the level of obedience that I'm talking about. So when we're watching, the level of obedience that we're looking for is, again, the implementation of what we see in Matthew 5 through Matthew 7. That whole conversation there that Christ is giving is talking about how to function, how to live, and how to think. And at the time when he was saying that to his audience, they were unaccustomed to hearing that. And not that way. Not to behave in that manner. They were used to people extolling on the scriptures and using another rabbi's point of reference as clarification. But Christ spoke from his own authority and basically said, don't do this, don't do that. Behave and act and think in this manner. So if you're really engaged with God, these are the qualities that are going to show. Another example I often give related to this, and it's because it was so pertinent to what I'm talking about that I continue to bring it up. There was a time I went to House of Pancakes, and the waitress was new and didn't know how to perform her job. And the only thing she could do well was bring napkins to the table. And that's all she could do. She didn't know how to take an order. She didn't know how to bring the food. She couldn't do squat, but she could bring napkins. And so during that time that I'm there, I was inundated with napkins. And she would come to the table. Hi, is everything okay? Everything's good? And here's some napkins. And she'd walk away. And then she'd come back another 5 or 10 minutes later. How's everything? Okay, good. Here's some napkins. She was very nervous, and that's why she was doing that. But I didn't need any more napkins. What I did need, she couldn't do. She couldn't perform as a waitress because she just didn't have those fundamental skills. And she messed up the bill entirely. I know she got in trouble. And as a young man, I didn't have enough maturity to speak up on that because, as I said, she didn't know what she was doing. But she could bring napkins. And in the game, in the world of waitressing, I ain't gonna help you bringing napkins. That's not your strongest feature. And as a Christian, oh, you can show up on Saturday. It's not your strongest feature. It's not gonna work. When you need a certain level of obedience, because a certain level of obedience ensures you abilities to be able to function in certain periods of time. And we as Christians are going to come upon a time that will be critical, and it will call for us to be able to perform in a certain way. And if you haven't been doing the stuff for real at home, you're not going to be able to bring out what's not there. And you will find yourself in a situation. So turning back to Matthew 24 and in verse 45. Christ then begins to talk about who is the person then that has that level of functioning that they should have. Verse 45 of chapter 24 in Matthew. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at the proper time? And so there's a dual aspect to this. On the one hand, you have individuals that are responsible to caring for the needs of others in the church. And then you're going to have other individuals that are responsible to each other and themselves in their behavior. And Christ starts off, who then is the faithful and wise servant? Who is faithful? Who is obedient? Who is patiently waiting in God? Who is going to endure? And as a result, an extension of that, therefore, will have all these other attributes, one of which will be wisdom. One of which will be those that are wise, that can interpret what they need to at that critical moment, because they're plugged in with God. If you're not plugged in with God on that level of obedience that you need to have, then you're not going to have certain abilities, one of which will be wisdom. And without that wisdom, you can't interpret your world and what you need to do at critical junctures in time. The Christian finds themselves having to recognize this is the case. So if you are a retail store and you're not functioning at the level that you need to meet the needs of your customer at a critical juncture, another store opens right across the street from you doing what you do, but doing it better, now you have a problem. If you are a sports player and all you can do is just fake it and have a nice uniform, but you really can't play, then you will not win games. And yes, not to skip the analogy that Christ used, an apple tree is not going to grow oranges. And an orange tree is not going to grow apples. A dog is not going to move. And a cow is not going to bark. And if it does, it's sick. And it has whooping cough. And you take it to the vet. But naturally, you are not going to get a change in the behaviors amongst these species. And so a Christian is just not supposed to have certain qualities. They're not supposed to exhibit that and behave a certain way. We look at the news and we see a person does something atrocious, and their family member is going, well, that's just not like them. They would never do that. It's in people to do certain things. But as a Christian, what's in you? When it's called for, do you have those attributes? Are you doing those things that are in Matthew 5 through 7? Are you connected with God in that manner? Are you praying, studying, applying what you learn, enduring, and repeating that process so that you're able to implement all those things in Matthew 5 through 7 into your logic, your reasoning, your thinking, and your behavior? Mind you, again, all of that is done in secret. Nobody's watching. You're not looking for attention if you're really doing what those chapters are saying to do. Because those that showboat, they're spoken about. Doing it for real, that level of obedience is what we are to be putting forward. That's what we are to be watching when Christ says, watch, because you don't know the hour and the time. And in that shout out to the past, for those that would just simply look at political events, it's not enough to watch McNeil and Lara report. It's not going to help you if you don't have these attributes within you. And I'm sure many of you will surmise what I just mentioned is a political minutia. So again, not obeying God makes it so we won't have certain attributes. Not having those attributes means we won't have the things that God blesses us with that enable us to have the fundamental behaviors and skills that a Christian would have. Using God's Spirit, enabling us to understand those things. At those crucial moments of time, we won't be able to act. Again, you can't fake that. Matthew 7, verse 21. Matthew 7, verse 21. Christ says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." And so again, we have this level of obedience that's called for. This is what is necessary to begin to be prepared for whatever will happen in the future. We have to be prepared in this manner. We have to be able to engage with God in this manner. When Christ spoke of watching and referencing that individual that is anticipating Christ's return, who is that good and faithful servant? That faithful and wise servant, the one that's obedient and the one that is being blessed with all the abilities that come from being connected with God, including wisdom. So let's turn back to Matthew 24 and verse 48. Matthew 24, continuing in the process that Christ was in, where he was admonishing the individual that's doing things the right way, that's approaching things the right way, that's watching and patiently waiting and enduring in the right way. Now he switches to talk about that other guy. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, "My master is staying away a long time. Christ ain't coming back anytime soon. I could get into all the stuff I want to, and it's not going to matter. I could change later." And all those things may be all the sinful nature, the wrong way of thinking. Your level of frick and frat doesn't have to be what the world calls bad. Once you begin to deviate from pursuing God in earnest, you're already starting to spin out of control. Many times when young people learn to drive, they will assume habits that aren't good. And they're not experienced enough to play around the way they're playing at that point in their driving career. So you can lean back and do other things and have the radio blasting and drive with one hand. And you've been driving for 20 years. And if something were to happen, you more than likely would be able to recover. But the kid that just learned how to drive, and he's driving with one hand with the music blazing, and he's doing 70, and he hits that turn that he's not expecting, he can't recover. He doesn't know to. He doesn't have the skills necessary. He never practiced. And so then when it's called upon, it's not there, and he crashes. Many of those individuals die. The Christian Can't play like that. They won't be ready, which is why Christ is saying, don't do that. It won't work. And so for those that would go, Christ is not coming back anytime soon. The kid driving like that was not expecting that turn. You weren't expecting little Timmy to run in front of you in front of the car. And lo and behold, Timmy is not wearing his bumpers. So when you hit him, he won't recover. This is important. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is staying away a long time. Wicked is kind of a strong word, right? We're not wicked. I mean, I'm here. Show up. But again, the level of obedience that God is calling for, when you're not doing that, well, that's the wicked. And we do have this sense of just degrees of sin. And that too will trip you up. And in our own mind, we begin to think, well, I'm not that bad. When you take your hand right out of hot water and put it in lukewarm water, it's cold. In actuality, it really isn't. Perspective. Because you're so off kilter or wicked that when you do remove your hand into lukewarm water, it seems like you went from one extreme to the other. And the lukewarm guy is no better than you. So that doesn't help. My master is staying away a long time. So I could do whatever I want. God isn't coming back. And Christ continues, and he then begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunkards. And symbolically, when Christ is talking, particularly in Revelation, when he refers to people being drunk, those are people that have deviated from God's way of life and that level of obedience. And they've begun to drink and get drunk with the world. Now, those people that get drunk with the world, maybe they pay their taxes. And maybe they actually eat their vegetables and exercise. They seem like good people. They tuck their kids in at night. Maybe they don't even swear around their kids. I mean, you can't get any better than that, right? That's not the level of righteousness that we're using. God's righteousness. If you're not employing that, then you're not going to have the fundamentals that you need. And then in that crucial time, you won't have the ability to decipher the things that you need to decipher. And this is what Christ is saying. And so this individual goes, my master is staying away a long time. And he then begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunkards. He's now processing things the way the world does, thinking the way the world does. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he is not aware of. Because this wicked individual, that by other means in society would be seen as a good person, because they show up to church on Saturday. Maybe they don't eat pork, but you don't know how they're thinking and living on the inside. They will be caught off guard and find that Christ is coming at a time that they do not expect him and at an hour that they are not aware of. They are not able to recognize anything more. They weren't watching. And you know what? They may have actually been watching CNN. They may have actually been watching Fox News, Newsmax, McNeil Lehrer Report, reading the New York Times, the Washington Post, or whatever periodical you could think of. They were plugged in. Maybe they were a Democrat, a Republican, or maybe they were an independent. Maybe they were politically minded. Maybe they were with the Green Party. Maybe they recycled. Not good enough. This is not the degree of behavior that we are called to operate on. And so, because they didn't have those attributes that only come from that level of obedience that we see in Matthew 5 through 7, they didn't have the qualities that they needed, one of which would have been wisdom. And without that spiritual godly wisdom, they weren't able to interpret their world around them. And so we don't do this. And this is the first step. What is it that we need to watch? Ourselves. So when Christ goes, watch therefore, that's a call to look at yourself and be ready in that sense. What's your relationship like with God? In secret, what are you doing? How are you implementing these changes? It's not just for the spring holy days where people mistakenly take this concept of, oh, I need to change and be ready solely in this period of time. And it has a beginning and an end, and then you go on about your business. Because there's actually more to those holy days than just that. It's more than just self-evaluation in that sense, in the sense of virtues. No, there's spiritual components here. So watch yourself. Without that level of obedience, you won't understand going forward. And with that level of obedience, we're then able to move forward and try to understand things. Amos chapter 3, verse 7, we see an example of who God is going to field information to. Amos 3 and in verse 7. Surely the sovereign Lord does nothing without revealing his plan to his servants, the prophets. This is showing that God is going to let those that are following him, those that are plugged into him, have a sense and understanding of what is going to come in the future. And when you look at the scriptures that preceded, some of those will resonate with us in terms of how assured it is that God is actually looking to make sure that those that follow him have an understanding of what's going to happen. And I say some of which because, again, we're not in an agricultural society, and some of these things slip by us. God says, do two walk, in verse 3, do two walk together unless they have agreed to do so? Two people are not going to be walking side by side unless it was their intent to do that. Manhattan, New York City, once upon a time, was a very busy place. It doesn't really look like that anymore. Even so, take any place in the city or any place wherever you are as someone is walking. Walk right beside them, stride and stride. What's going to happen? What are you doing? If someone does that to you in the supermarket as you're walking down the aisle, it would be odd. And it's particularly if they're not with you, because you didn't agree to do that. And this is what God is saying. If two people didn't agree to do that, it's not going to happen. And in the same way, God is saying, I'm going to let those that are interacting with me know what's going on. In the same way that if two people were walking together, that was their intent. Does a lion roar in a thicket when it has no prey? I don't know. That don't have nothing to do with me. I can't relate. And so I get the point that maybe God is trying to make, but, like 4,000 years later, my lion game is a little weak. And so this is what I mean. I'll skip that one. Does it growl in its den when it has caught nothing? I don't know. I can't relate. I could relate a little better to the next one in verse 5. Does a bird swoop down to a trap on the ground when no bait is there? Why would it? If it does, if there's intent, and again, God is driving home. He's trying to reason with humans on their level to show them, I'm really putting out information there for you to receive because it's with intent. Does a trap spring up from the ground if it is not caught anything? These things aren't going to happen that way. And so you're getting the point that God is trying to make. And so God will extend certain information to those that are following him. But if they are not obedient, if they are not waiting in God, patiently waiting, if they're not enduring, then they're not going to have the attributes they need to process things on the level that they need to be processing things. They won't be able to function with the fundamentals that they need And they will lack one of those qualities, wisdom, in order to discern what they need to do during critical times. They can't do it. You download a program onto your phone or your computer, and you don't have the mechanism already there, you can't do anything with it. You can't open up a Word document if you don't have Word. And so you see that there are prerequisites that you're going to need in order to be able to function. So, as we look at the world and try to understand what's happening, as we approach the Feast of Trumpets, that pictures how man's governments are going to be replaced by God's governments, it brings into question, when are these things that all the holy days are picturing, when are these things going to begin to happen? And we start to examine that and look around. And we've always been told to look at political events to try to get a sense of what's going to happen. Well, X, Y, and Z got elected to office, or X, Y, and Z got deposed, or this country has this issue or that problem. Maybe things are happening. Is that what we are supposed to be watching? And so we reviewed those things and we surmised that first and foremost, what we are supposed to be watching is us, our character, how we are plugged into God. Without doing that, you really can't move forward. It's a prerequisite. And you won't have the understanding of how to process anything that comes afterwards. And before I stepped away, I gave an example of how people are warned to go back to their seats for the rest of the show at a Broadway show. And the lights flicker in the whole building and on the outside of the building. And if you were unfamiliar, you just would not know what was going on and what that meant. It wouldn't mean anything for you unless you were properly schooled and you were properly plugged in. And unless you, as a Christian, are properly schooled by applying what we see in Matthew 5 through 7, then when that critical juncture appears, you won't know what to do. And you will respond like the person that may have been standing outside watching the lights flicker and not know what to do. And they will miss 20 minutes of the show after they spent $150 to $200 on a ticket. They will not be pleased. And likewise, as a Christian, we don't want to get caught unaware. And so, with that understanding, we saw that God is wanting people to understand, and he makes those extinctions for people to understand what he's doing. And one of the principles to recognize is that man has been given 6,000 years to do things at his own autonomy. And then after those 6,000 years, God will establish his government and show man how to do things according to his law. We see this consistently throughout the Bible. We get examples of that all the time. We have the examples of the 7 holy days, and Passover, the days of unleavened bread, and all the things that means as we go through that process of how God has a blueprint or a plan for redeeming man back into a relationship with him. And those 7 holy days cover a period of 7,000 years. We have Israel's agricultural system, which again shows the same thing as we see how they reap their crops in the springtime and then in the latter part of the year in the fall time. And what that means symbolically, and how people are brought into an understanding at certain periods of time in this 7,000-year period. We have the creation week. Same thing. A lot of times people may not recognize it that way, but that is something that's going on. Where, again, you have this sense of there's a 7,000-year period. I'll touch on it for a second. And so you have 7 days, again, 7,000-year period. And each day something specific is happening. And chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the lightness from the darkness. God called the light day, and the dark he called night. And you could see spiritual connotations in that period. But you ever recognize the way God does a day, it starts at night, the darkest part, and it ends with the daylight. What do you think God's trying to say? Maybe not the way people think of a day. We start in the daytime. But that's not the way it works in real time. The world is engulfed in darkness. The world is separated from God. The world is detached from God during the 6,000 years. And then the world will be redeemed in the latter part of that 7,000-year period. And so, the light, God, comes on the heels of the darkness afterwards. Continuing on. And God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening, and there was morning the second day. You begin to see this separation, this parting. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And you read that to a kid right before they go to sleep, and it's like, oh, isn't that nice? What a nice thing to fall asleep on. There's more than that. God is now establishing distinctions, and he's making separations between those that he has called, those that he selected, those that he has set apart, and those that he hasn't. And then we begin to see this separation that will go on for a period of time during the 6,000 years until God is ready to expand this to all people. All people that are represented by certain aspects of this creation process as well. And there are a lot of other symbolic gestures and ways of looking at this as you go through each day. But again, just to touch on it for a second, you see this in the creation plan, that there's a 6,000-year period in which man will screw around and do things on his own. When you look at what Moses wrote in Psalm 90, verse 4, Moses wrote a psalm, and in verse 4, he recognizes that God sees one day as 1,000 years. Peter does the same thing in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. And there's 7 days in a week. And we see the 7 holy days and so on and so forth. And we see the 7,000-year period again. And so we see that there is this aspect where man has a government that isn't operating according to God's way. And it will be replaced by God's government. Another example in which we see that is in Daniel. In Daniel chapter 2, we have the story of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2 and in verse 31. And it has a geopolitical connotation to it, and how the governments of man are in power, and then following that, God's government will come. And so Daniel has been called to interpret this dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and we have this described, and Daniel is speaking. He says, Your Majesty, look, and there's before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. And we see these distinctions all going through the body. Daniel continues, while you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken into pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. Daniel goes on to explain what that statue meant, with the head being of gold, and the chest and arms of silver, and the belly and thighs of bronze, and the legs of iron, with the feet being made of iron and partly baked clay. And they had political connotations to them, geographical political connotations to them. This was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. Your majesty, you are the king of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and mighty and glory. In your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds in the sky. In other words, he's telling Nebuchadnezzar, you have been endowed with power and an authority, and you have this political system, this that I'm sure had a degree of bureaucracy and such, and it had an economy. It had, what's the word I'm looking for? Nevertheless, it had a structure to it. It did have an economy. It was a functioning, organized political system. Nevertheless, he continues, in your hands he has placed all mankind, the beasts of the field and the birds in the sky, so on and so forth. Verse 39, after you, another kingdom will arise inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that, the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron. And so we see this distinction. And in hindsight, we look back and we can see this political, geopolitical structure that played out. And so Nebuchadnezzar was the head of Babylon, and that was the head of the statue made of gold. The chest and arms of silver would have been the Medo-Persians, and the belly and thighs of bronze would have been the Greek during their time of dominance, the Greek Empire. The legs of iron would have been the Roman Empire. And by the time you got to the feet, partly of iron and partly of baked clay, it would have been the resurgence of that Roman Empire, the period of Europe that will, no, I take that back. The period of geopolitical powers that will exist in the end time. I say that because you don't know how things are going to play out. You don't know if it really will be 10 kings, 10 nations made up in Europe. It could be 10 countries around the world. You really don't know. Because when you think about it, and you think about what is supposed to happen and how things are going to play out, the Christian nations that exist today are political nations that have some dominance now. Everybody's looking at Europe. You don't know how that's going to play out. What happens to the United States and Canada and Britain and Australia and so on and so forth? What happens to them? And I know people get sidetracked with the British Israelism and so forth. I'm not doing that per se. I'm just saying you have some economic and even military powers that exist today that are primarily ascribing to a Christian religion. They're the fan club that's going to be most responsive to a beast power that turns around and goes, hey, I'm Christ. So you're just going to dismiss that? Who knows? As we look at prophecy to come, we get into a point where there's a lot of surmising. There's supposition, speculation. That's the word I was looking for. There's speculation. Y'all can help, you know. You just got to sit there and stare at me. And so, finally, after we get beyond the feat of iron and clay, thank you very much. I do appreciate it. This is what I'm talking about. After we get to that point, we find that God's kingdom then comes on the scene. This large, giant rock that's going to grow and expand and take up all things. And so we see this geopolitical structure that takes place throughout the 6,000 years. And once we're in that frame of mind, we can now move forward. So one, we understand, what are we looking for? We need to have a certain degree of obedience in how we function just from start. And that requires to have a healthy relationship with God. And that requires to be implementing, using God's Spirit, the things that we see in Matthew 5 through Matthew 7. In so doing, we will have a certain understanding. We will have certain attributes and abilities, one of which would be wisdom, to interpret what is around us. In the same way an individual would interpret certain signs, such as the lights flashing at a show. You need to go back to your seat. But if you don't know, you won't know how to respond. And that's what happens to people that are disconnected from the appropriate level of obedience that God is calling for. Hence, the wicked. And so people may go, I'm not wicked. If you're not keeping God's law the way He's saying, then yeah, you're wicked. And so, with that understanding and the understanding of the geopolitical structures that have been taking place throughout the 6,000 years, we can now begin to look at things and try to see what is it we are going to look for with the end times coming. Questions we all have, questions that have been asked for the longest, questions that the disciples themselves would have asked. So now, turning back to Matthew 24, and in verse 3, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? When is this stuff going to start? What do we look for? That's their question. Dropping down to verse 21. Here we see a little bit of Christ's answer. It's extensive. And all of the chapter 24, chapter 25 in Matthew, where Christ is answering. When you look at the synoptic gospels, you'll see synoptic meaning this seem to be the same. Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to be the same, so they're called synoptic. John's is a little different in the structure and in the way he tells things. It's written with a different intent to the reader. And so Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, this is Christ's response in those chapters. And so Christ begins to answer. And throughout those chapters, or two that compose his answer, but we're going to take pieces of it. And part of his answer is here in verse 21. For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. And so we see there's going to be a lot of calamity. There's not all good times, this period of time, and we recognize that. We turn over to Daniel chapter 12. We can see a similar response or pattern play out in what God shared with Daniel for us to understand as we look at things. Daniel 12, and in verse 1. At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. Michael is referring to one of the archangels that serve God. There will be a time of distress, such as not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. So we have a period of time, just like Christ described before, of calamity. to the degree that it's never been like that before and it's never going to reach such heights again. And it's around this time, this period of time, where that final political structure that we saw being made of, what was that again with the feet? Now y'all are quiet. Okay. Iron and clay? All right, thank you. Iron and clay. It's around that time that God is going to come back, that big stone, and reestablish his government. And we see certain things that are going to continue to happen. Verse 2, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, roll up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge. So towards the end, this could mean one of two things. It could just mean general knowledge that's secular, or general knowledge about God will be increased. But here we see in the Old Testament things we don't often attribute to the Old Testament, where Daniel is seeing that in the end times, the government of man will be deposed, and Christ will return, and that those that have obeyed God through the 6,000 years will be resurrected as spirit beings. Daniel chapter 5, continuing on. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there before me stood two others, one on this bank of the river and one on the opposite bank. Daniel is seeing two angels standing on each side of a river, and they're talking to each other. One of them said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long will it be before these astonishing things are fulfilled? So when the disciples approached Christ, their question was, when are these things going to start? But here, the question that the two angels are bantering between themselves isn't when they're going to start. The question is, when it does start, how long is it going to last? So now we're dealing with a different question. Now, Christ, in answering them, he took up about 2 chapters. He does answer them, but I mean, they had to wait and listen to what he's saying, as do we, instead of just giving them a one-word answer, like, oh, it's going to start on X, Y, and Z date at 11:45. He doesn't do that. And in fact, he says the opposite. He says it doesn't work that way. No man knows the hour or the time. And so now we have a question being posed here in Daniel. And this question is, once things do start, once they do jump off, how long is it going to last? You have enemies. And you know when you step outside, you're going to get beat up. You're going to get jumped. And so if you plan on stepping outside at 3 o'clock, it's safe to assume you're going to catch a good beatdown at 3. The disciples asked, when are things going to start? But another thing that may be important to you, if you're willing to take this beatdown, how long is it going to last? All right, I'll suffer through it. Just how long is it going to last? Is it a minute, 2 minutes? How long y'all going to stomp me out? People go for a medical procedure. What time do I have to be there and what day? And they'll show up, particularly if it needs to be done. How long is this going to take? Is it going to hurt? Am I going to be under? Am I going to feel anything? These are the questions people have as natural. And so, again, the disciples asked, when are things going to start? And now we're being posed with the question, how long will it last? How long will it be before these astonishing things are fulfilled? The man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river lifted his right hand and his left hand toward heaven, and I heard him swear by him who lives forever, saying, it will be for a time, times, and a half a time. Well, that's not very informative. If you really want to duck having to deal with an appointment, this would perhaps be a good way of addressing it. Well, what time do I meet you? Maybe about a time and a half a time. I see you over there. What? And so, yes, it may be hard to decipher. And wouldn't it be better to just be a little bit more straightforward? But again, those with wisdom, they will be able to decipher it. And in the end time, knowledge will be increased and certain things will be more prevalent in understanding. It will be for a time, 1 year, times plural, 2 year, and a half a time, half a year. It will be for a year, 2 years, and a half a year. That's 3.5 years. When the power of the holy people has been finally broken, all these things will be completed. Something is going to happen in this final governmental structure where those that are claimed by God as a physical peoples and as a spiritual peoples, they're going to have some sort of problem and they're going to be overcome. And this period of time before Christ returns is going to elapse for 3.5 years. A time, times, and half a time. Verse 8, I heard, but I did not understand. Daniel was like, what? Because the speaker wasn't standing behind him translating everything. He didn't understand. And so I asked, my Lord, what will the outcome of all of this be? How's this going to play out? Because he's not understanding. He replied, go your way, Daniel, because the words are rolled up and sealed until the time of the end. You're not going to need to know. It doesn't apply to you. Many will be purified, made spotless and refined. And how are you purified, made spotless and refined? Through staying in touch with God, through prayer, study, application, endurance, and repeat. Through applying Matthew 5-7. To be purified, made spotless and refined, that does not mean your life is going to go smoothly and everything is going to be fine. That does not mean your loved ones are going to be fine. That does not mean that you're going to maintain your sight throughout your life and maintain all your bodily functions. That does not mean things are not going to go wrong. That process of purification, being made spotless and refined, means you will learn obedience through suffering just like Christ did. That's part of this process. And so it could throw you. Like, why is this happening? Is this the way it goes? This is the purification process. This is the made spotless process. And this is the refining process. And many over the 6,000 years will have that happen. And so what does that mean? You got a lot of blind, broken, limping, unhappy, sad, depressed, emotionally hurt, lonely people that are clinging to God through these 6,000 years, because this is how they're purified, made spotless and refined. This is the Christian life, the Christian walk. Despite what the imposter religion would lead you to believe. Nevertheless, the angel says, many will be purified, made spotless and refined, but the wicked will continue to be wicked. And we covered who those wicked people are. They're sitting right next to all the other people being purified, spotless, and refined. But the purification process, the spotless process, and refining process, they're fighting it. Because they're not trying to get down like that. No, they don't want to lose their life. They want to keep it. They want to save it. So they can't accept going blind. And if they do, well, then there is no God. Now I'm an atheist. Forget you, forget this religion. I'm not doing this anymore. They're not trying to accept the failures that come in life, the difficulties and so forth. But those that are following God, that are applying Matthew 5-7, they're being purified, made spotless, and refined. And because of that, they have the attributes of God, and they are able to enact this ability at the critical moments and junctures in time so that they can understand the things that they need to understand. Unlike the wicked, they won't have that understanding. And continuing on, But the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. The wicked can't understand. Even though they come to church, if they're not allowing that process to work, they're not going to be capable. Just like those sports players. If they don't practice on their skills and all they do is just try to have a nice clean uniform, well, they won't be able to be any more dominant on the field. It won't work. Just like that waitress. If she didn't learn how to be a better waitress and how to incorporate the skills that she would need to do her job, and all she could do is bring napkins, yeah, that waitressing career ain't going anywhere. And so it is with the Christian. We have to be obedient. We have to wait, patiently wait for God, endure. This is what is necessary. And so we'll now go back to those synoptic gospels again. And just to review, one, we have this question, what are we supposed to look for? What is it we need to do? Christ tells us to watch. All right, so we start watching. What do we watch? The news? No, you're going to watch yourself. And what are you looking for? You're looking to see that you're able to maintain and work on your relationship with God by applying, and Christ listed it out. As God, he's telling you what you need to do. Matthew 5 through 7. That's your daily life. You're applying that. And in so doing and obeying God, you will then have the attributes and abilities that come from one that knows how to wield God's Spirit and obey God. And you will also be blessed with understanding. You will have, as a part of your repertoire, an ability to understand what you need to understand at critical junctures in time. The wicked won't understand. They're not plugged in. But the righteous will. The ones that are waiting, the ones that are enduring, the ones that are obeying, they will. So now let's turn back to Luke 21. As I turn, I continue that beyond just watching, we're going to recognize that there is a political structure that takes place throughout this 6,000 years. And that structure, man's government, will be replaced by God's government. So we do recognize those things, but we see what is pertinent. What is a prerequisite is that we must watch ourselves and be plugged in with God and understand that God is wanting to share this information with us. And he does. But if we're not obeying, we won't understand. Luke 21 and verse 20. Christ is continuing to answer the question that was posed to him. When is this stuff going to start? The disciples asked, when is it going to start? We just came from Daniel, where we heard how long it's going to last, when it starts. Now we're back to the question where they were asking, when is it going to start? Christ continues in these two chapters of Matthew and Mark and Luke, respectively, starting in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, it encompasses his answer. But we're jumping into Luke 21, verse 20. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. For this is the time of punishment and fulfillment of all that has been written. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now some will say, oh, that happened already when the Romans came and trashed the place. But it's going to happen again until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. There are other scriptures in Daniel chapter 9 and chapter 7 where you'll start to see that verbiage again, time, times, and half a time. In the time of the Gentiles is going to be a period of time where this governmental system will come and take over Jerusalem for 3.5 years. Nevertheless, starting in verse 20, Christ began to answer, and he says, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. Armies of this political structure that was made up of the feet of iron and clay. Was it iron and clay? Yeah, okay, thank you. That final governmental structure that will be replaced by God, they're the ones extolling this. And he says that you will know that his desolation is near. You're going to see that phrase a lot, particularly the phrase, the abomination of desolation. And a lot of people try to figure out what does that mean. Well, the Bible right here says it's armies surrounding Jerusalem. Others may want to advocate that it's a statue being erected in the temple at some point in time, or that it happened in the past before. I'm only going on what I could play with directly. And so I will use that. The thing with prophecy, when you look forward, it is speculative. So people may speculate. I can only play with what's here on the paper, the work. And so I use that definition for the abomination of desolation, the one that Christ used. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. And so that's what armies do. They desolate. And it's abomination what they do. And it's more that they just come in and trash the place. It's more than that. We turn to Zechariah 14, and you can see a description of what that army is going to do. A description that's played out a little bit more in detail in Zechariah. Zechariah 14. Zechariah 14 and in verse 1. Watch, for the day of the Lord is coming, when your possessions will be plundered right in front of you. I will gather all the nations to fight against Jerusalem. The city will be taken, the houses looted, and the women raped. Half the population will be taken into captivity, and the rest will be left among the ruins of the city. Then the Lord will go out to fight against those nations as he has fought in times past. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will split apart, making a wide valley running from east to west. Half the mountain will move toward the north and half toward the south. You will flee through this valley, for it will reach across the Zal. Yes, you will flee as you did from the earthquake in the days of King Uzziah of Judah. Then the Lord, my God, will come, and all his holy ones with him. So, the way that just described things, one, the army clearly does not have manners. Two, it's showing around when this is going to happen. People may try to say, oh, this is going to happen later, it's going to happen then. No, it's going to happen around that period of time. Towards the end of that 3.5 years. Christ coming back, rather, with the host of all his holy ones. But when that army does attack Jerusalem, they will be in power, ruling there for 3.5 years. Now understand that political structure will be headed by an individual that purports himself to be Christ. That is very important. Now going back to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24, verse 15. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, again, the way the definition we use is that's the armies of the governmental structure and power at that time, often called the beast power, surrounding Jerusalem. That's how Luke defined it. So that's the same definition I'm using here when I'm reading Matthew, and he's speaking of it. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. And now we have a little wink wink thing going on. Essentially, the lights at the Broadway show are flashing. And you have patrons going, what does that mean? What do I do? And so you will have individuals when this is going on. Some people are going, well, okay, what does that mean? What do I do? Only those that are plugged in with God will have the ability to understand what's going on. They will be wise. They're using their Holy Spirit to be plugged into God. They're following Matthew chapter 5 through 7. They have oil in their lamps as one of the virgins, as one of the people in the church. Unlike those without oil in their lamps, those that are not doing what they should have been, that are being called wicked, they're the ones going, what do? I don't understand. I don't have the ability to understand. So give me some of your oil so that I can understand, so that I can have that attribute of wisdom. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Christ is now telling people reading, something's going on in Daniel that is related to his answer. And so we'll now turn back to Daniel. Daniel chapter 12, where we were before. And I'll pick up where I left off in verse 11. From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished, and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. All right, now they're going to start throwing numbers at us. 1, from the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished. What's that talking about? And then 2, and the abomination that causes desolation is set up. There's going to be this period of time, 1,290 days. We already know, using the definition that we were using, the abomination of desolation is the army surrounding Jerusalem. The army surrounding Jerusalem by that final political power. So we got that part. But then it says, from the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished. Now, in this scripture, when you read the Hebrew, it just says daily. It doesn't say sacrifice. The translators injected that in there to help people understand. Because if you look at the word daily, it's used about 5 other times in the book of Daniel. It's always related to the sacrifices. That's the way Daniel was using it. He was using it pertaining to the sacrifices that were taking place. And now he uses this word, and just doesn't use the word sacrifice, but everybody knows what you're talking about if you're still stuck on it. So, in order to have a sacrifice stop, you have to have a sacrifice start. From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, between these 2 points, from when the sacrifices stop and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, those 2 points together, there's going to be an elapsement of time of 1,290 days before Christ comes back, before that stone comes back and smashes those feet. You will see other numbers in other places that can be confusing. I don't even know if I should bring that up. I don't want to confuse anyone. But nevertheless, in order for sacrifices to start, they have to stop. That's key in order to understand this in the next verse. This appears to be very relevant, that sacrifices must start in Jerusalem in order for this to have any meaning. And they're going to be stopped. And when they're stopped, it's related to the abomination of desolation, or these armies surrounding Jerusalem. When these armies come and surround Jerusalem and they force the sacrifices to stop, 1,290 days are going to go by before Christ comes back. It's a time gauge that Christ is saying. Now, once that happens and that starts, then people are going to, in the know, are going to realize that things are starting. But we're looking out for this to start. We're looking out for this to happen. And this is part of the answer to Christ's question. The disciples ask, when are these things going to begin to happen? And he starts giving this answer. kind of codedly. Well, you got to know about Daniel. Let the reader understand. In order for the sacrifice to start, or rather to be stopped, it has to start. And it's going to be stopped by the abomination of desolation, these armies. 1,290 days are going to go by. Continuing on. Blessed is the one who waits, who continues to obey God, who continues to endure, who continues to patiently wait. The righteous, they're going to have understanding, but not the wicked. And so blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1,335 days. And now that'll make the reader go, what are you talking about? You just gave another number before, and now you're bringing up something completely different. What's going on? We understand that sacrifices are stopped, and they're stopped by the armies that come, the abomination of desolation. And from that time, the 1,290 days that go by, that signals when Christ would come back at the end of that period having elapsed and gone by. Now, this angel goes, blessed are the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1,335 days, not spoken of anywhere else. And so, one of the more dominant views of interpreting this, as I said, in order for the sacrifices to be stopped, they have to start. And this 1,335 days would be used as the starting point. And so 45 days before the 1,290 is being used as saying that's when the sacrifices start. From the time the sacrifices start to when Christ comes back is 1,335 days. 45 days will elapse, and then the armies will surround Jerusalem, the abomination of desolation, and they'll stop the sacrifices from being offered. That 45 days may be actually critical or important and significant. It may entail a behavior or a response to take place in that 45 days. And again, the wise will understand, those that are obeying God at that time will understand what may be happening with that. Is everybody clear on that? You sure? If you're not, you can say so. Everybody clear on the difference? I don't believe you. I simply don't believe you. So, we're talking about sacrifices. Sacrifices must start. Once sacrifices start, it will go 1,335 days before Christ comes back. 45 days later, they're going to be stopped, and the armies are going to surround Jerusalem, and that's from that point on is going to be 1,290 days. It's like, you got a relative or something, and they were born in the same year but earlier than you. Well, okay, it's just a difference in time. Are you sure, everybody? I'm getting it. All right. Still don't believe you. All right. So we see, with looking at this, we have these sacrifices that somehow seem important. And once those sacrifices start, we have hard numbers of what would happen next. So you would think we're going to look for these sacrifices to start. Beyond watching ourselves and how we are plugged into God, and beyond just looking at how things happen in the news, we're going to be keyed into this, recognizing how man's government has been going by over these 6,000 years. This certainly would perk anybody's interest. We had questions, and we were trying to recognize what is it we need to be looking for as we approach the Feast of Trumpets. What is it we ought to be watching for? Do we pay attention to whether there are going to be 10 nations in the European Union? Or do we look to see if the world has one world currency? Whatever other things that may come up. Is that it? What's the most important thing? And we find that Christ said that he wanted us to watch. But what should we be watching? all those political things. First and foremost, a prerequisite, mandatory. You have to watch your relationship with God and be doing actively the things that God instructs us to do. That is obedience. Matthew 5 through Matthew 7, employing those things. It will endow you with the ability to function and think like God and have certain attributes that you will need, one of which will be wisdom. The wise and those that are obeying God are promised to understand things at critical junctures in time. But the wicked won't. The wicked could very well come to church. The wicked could very well say, oh, I enjoy coming here. The wicked could very well come for the pound cake after service. And I have to admit, I wouldn't blame them. But that's not what's most important. And if you sidestep or short step that process, you will not be able to function and implement the skills that you need to have exhibited. You just can't. You can't display what you don't have within you. And you will not have the wisdom that you need to understand what you need to understand at a critical juncture in time. Keep in mind in Christ's parable of the 10 virgins, that is the church. Half have oil and the other half don't. Half. Can you imagine what that will look like in the church if the church is divided like that? Yeah, we've seen it many times. And again, look how divisive COVID was over whether, say, a person wore a mask or didn't. And people had pros and cons and how they related to each of those viewpoints. For those that wanted to wear a mask, they felt if you didn't, well, that's just, you're not being honoring your civic duty, you're not recognizing the needs of others, and protecting yourself and other people. For those that felt like it's not necessary to wear a mask, maybe they felt like, look, that's kind of oppressive and it's not necessary. I don't think there's anything to worry about. Listen, I still have concern for you. But after a while, that conversation going back and forth, eventually it got to your mama. Insults were being hurled. And you would think in a church, we wouldn't have that kind of, how do you go from that discussion of a difference of opinion and next thing you know, you've arrived at your mama? Essentially, that's what it was, and it became very toxic. And we saw it not just in the church, but in the secular world. And the words were way stronger than just your mama. It got really bad. Now, impart religiosity into that kind of exchange. And once you do that, well, now you're on a whole nother degree of emotion. And now it's this picture, if there were a man to step into the political spotlight and say, I am God, and he's able to do all these miracles, what kind of frenzy is going to happen? How are people going to act? And how will people look at those that are adhering to the Judeo-Christian way of life? If they did your mama over a mask, pro or con, what are they going to do with something as powerful and strong as a religious movement like that when this man really seems to be God? I mean, people cry at church from the music. What's going to happen when this man is there and he's God and he's healing people and it's real like that? It's not your mama anymore. It's off with your head. Kill them. And so you can have that degree of religious persecution because it happened before for the same reasons. And you see how it could get, how bad it could get. They do studies, like how does Germany, a society operating on a level like that, all of a sudden snap and have what they had happen, and everybody goes to work every day. Like, what? How do you get from point A to point B like that? Way beyond insults. And again, these things will happen. And so we see how important it is to have a relationship with God. We see how important it is to still recognize that man's structure is not appropriate enough. It lacks. It does not entertain God or a relationship with God. And God's government is going to supplant that. We then see some of the things that we will look for of most importance are those sacrifices. That's important. When those sacrifices begin, that's a real signal, and it has a real timetable connected to it. But right now, there's no man running around saying he's God. We're looking at all these different countries trying to see who can pop up. But you have to watch yourself. And then you look for, see, are there sacrifices right now? No, there are not. Can there be sacrifices right now? Can you imagine if the Jews tried to do that? What would happen in the Middle East? Would the opposing factors just all right, there would be problems. Nevertheless, we see that is a pertinent issue, those sacrifices taking place. And they haven't. And why not? Well, one of the reasons why these sacrifices have not begun is they can't. By the ceremonial law, by the Old Testament, they can't start. They don't have the prerequisites. They're missing something. They would love to start. In fact, they have movements already in existence in Israel. Movement to build a temple. They've saved up money. Movement to have an order of Levitical priests. They're already there, already trained, already picked. They just can't work yet. They already live in a way where they will not ceremonially defile themselves in case the day pops up and they're called to duty. Already right now. They already have the instruments and things to use in a temple if there ever was one. They've already made them. So what's the holdup? There's a ceremony that needs to take place in order for sacrifices to be resumed, in order for a temple to be reestablished. And that ceremony involves something called a red heifer. The red heifer is something more that you call your girlfriend or your friend when she just really rubs you the wrong way. That's not a red heifer. The red heifer is indeed a cow, but it is a red cow. And it is a cow that is all red. There's certain requirements that are necessary in order for this ceremony to take place, and they need an all red cow. We can understand the sense of having 100% pure. And I don't mean in a genetic way per se with humans. I didn't mean like that. Like an Aryan type of mentality. I meant like 100% gold, 100% chocolate. You know, chocolate covered. Well, that's not 100%. It's just covered. No, this cow has to be 100% red. All the hairs on the cow have to be red. Even the eyelashes have to be red. No, just the eyelashes. Not the inner organs or flesh. Just the outside of the cow. All red. We see this in Numbers 19, 1 through 10. I probably even won't have time to read that. But you see it commanded. I probably will read verse 10 because God tells Israel, after he explains this ceremony, it's going to be a continuing ordinance. Whenever God throws out that line, that means you got to keep doing it. The Sabbath is a continuing ordinance. The holy days are a continuing ordinance. This red heifer ceremony is a continuing ordinance. Here's the thing. How many red cows you see roaming around? So it's very rare. From the time of Moses till the time of the last temple that fell by the hands of the Romans, there were only 9 red heifers. It is believed that when the 10th red heifer is made available or appears, that it will also signal the return of Christ. This is how the Jews see it. And some of these Christians that have that entertain a Judeo-Christian culture, they recognize that and look at it that way too. So, from the time of Moses and to the time of the first temple and the second temple, they had red heifers. And you needed the red heifer to sacrifices, burn it, all of the cow, once it was sacrificed, and take its ashes and mix it with water. And when you did that, it created a concoction, and I don't mean to be insulting by calling it a concoction. I didn't get to work on my verbiage. Okay, a mixture. You have this concoction mixture, and they used that to make ceremonially pure those that would do the sacrifices, the temple. It allowed them to move forward. They couldn't move forward with any rituals without this concoction. You had to have it in order to clean the people and the individual priest and the temple itself. Just in order to offer sacrifices, that's what's impeding everything. Now, the Jews had no understanding of what that red heifer meant. And in fact, they had a name for it. I can't remember it. There's a term they use, and it's for the fact that they don't know what the heck it's for. They actually have a term for that. They have no understanding of why they do it, but they do it. When you read that description, maybe I'll try to do it real quick. I think that was Numbers 19, 1 through 10, right? So when you read the description of what they're told, you see similarities between Christ. It does reflect Christ. This cow is not to have any blemishes. It's not to have any broken bones. It's not supposed to be have a yoke placed on it. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is a requirement of the Lord that the Lord has commanded. Tell the Israelites to bring you a red heifer without defect or blemish like Christ, and that has never been under a yoke, never sinned. Give it to Eleazar, the priest, Aaron's son. It is to be taken outside the camp and slaughtered in his presence, just like Christ." There's a perimeter that the Jews would have that would go around the temple. It was an understood perimeter. It was very large, quite honestly, like about 10 football fields or so. They use this metric, I don't know, cubics or whatever, I don't understand that. We don't use that. So I say 10 football fields. It was very large. And so this circumference of the area was the area that they had in their mind. It was sectioned off. You had to be outside that area to do the sacrifice of this red heifer. The red heifer was sacrificed in the same place that Christ was crucified. And he was crucified outside the same perimeter of Jerusalem, or the temple. It's the same parallel. Then Eleazar, the priest, is to take some of its blood on his finger and sprinkle it 7 times towards the front of the tent of meeting. While he watches, the heifer is to be burned, its hide, flesh, blood, and intestines. The priest is to take some cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool and throw them onto the burning heifer. After that, the priest must wash his clothes and bathe himself with water. He may then come into the camp, where he will be ceremonially unclean till evening. The man who burns it must also wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he too will be unclean till evening, which is the end result that they were looking for with this red heifer. It would make things clean. And you see they're bathing. We talked about baptism and stuff before. This is what's going on, except they're doing it themselves. It isn't another individual doing it, but I won't divert too much. Verse 9, a man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer and put them in a ceremonially clean place outside the camp. They are to be kept by the Israelite community for use in the water of cleansing. It is for purification from sin. They need this red heifer mixed with the ashes mixed in water in order to purify the priest, the temple, and to be able to make sacrifices. The man who gathers up the ashes of the heifer must also wash his clothes, and he too will be unclean till evening. This will be a lasting ordinance, both for the Israelites and for the foreigners residing among them. This is a big deal. It's important. Without the red heifer and the ashes mixed in water, the Jews can't move forward. So where do they stand? There have been a lot of close calls over the years. In 2020, they had 3 heifers. And it looked like we're going to stay all red. But as the cow matures, it starts to grow hairs that are not white. The cow has to be between like 2 and 3 years. And so those cows, they had problems. The bull would get to the cow. And once the bull gets to the cow, then you can't do anything. You can't use that cow. When I say bull gets to the cow, I mean like boy likes girl sort of thing. Everybody understand? Okay, okay. All right. I mean, it's grown folks' Sabbath service, but still, sometimes people don't follow. Bull could get to the cow, or it could be disqualified in some other way. And they may grow hairs that are not white, red, rather. And so there were 3. There was hope that things were going to change, and especially what was going on in 2020 with COVID didn't work out. Today, there are 5 red cows that they brought from Texas to Israel. One of them got disqualified. Bull got to it. These bulls, man. Bull got to the cow. Now we're down to 4. One of those 4 cows grew 2 white hairs. Now it's like, all right, we're kind of down to 3.5 because they can pluck a hair out the cow. If the hair grows back red and it doesn't leave a blemish, they could, the cow could requalify itself. You're allowed to have 1 white hair. So we got 3.5. The other cows are still red, and they're about a year and change. This organization that's doing that is called the Temple Institute in Israel. You can look them up, and they have all of these things that they're doing. They give updates on the cows. Their attitude is, the way this is going, if any one of those 3 cows stay red, they're like, we're offering the cow on Passover. This coming Passover, they're going to sacrifice the cow. Remember, once that cow is sacrificed, and they have the ashes and mix it with water, they can now offer sacrifices. Here's another caveat. They don't need to build a temple in order to do sacrifices. They can build an altar in the place they need to build it, the same place where Christ was sacrificed. That point where the altar is, it needs to face directly in front of where the temple is. You know how we look at the skyline, you can see the you can see the Empire State Building from a distance. So they could see into the temple from where the altar is. They already bought the land for where the altar should be. They could build the altar there. Building a temple is something else if they choose to do so. They just need a red heifer in order to move forward. If they have a red heifer, and if any one of those 3 or 4 cows stays red, and they sacrifice it on Passover next year, they could have sacrifices, daily sacrifices. And that makes people unnerved. Because if you have daily sacrifices, does that mean that countdown starts? And are we looking for it to be stopped? There will be other things that need to happen at the same time. But what will happen, can happen, will somebody pop up around then saying, hey, I'm Christ? But those are the things to look for. Last point. This year is 2023. We are aiming to get to what? The end of 6,000 years. And then we would expect Christ to return. Now, to the Jews, they are in year 5,783, which means what? We got, what is that, 217 years left? So are you going to be like that servant that goes, my master isn't coming anytime soon? I can go do whatever I want. There's a problem with this. The problem is, a lot of scholars agree the number is off. It's not 5,783. They don't know how much it's off, but they do agree that it's off. And it gets very convoluted when they start arguing about where the time came from and what's this and what's that. You got to be careful with those guys too, because they'll focus on things that are not important. Remember when Christ said watch, he wasn't telling you to watch all the nonsense. Watch your character. Do what you're supposed to be doing and let all these other things play out. You stay mindful of what you're looking out for, those daily sacrifices to be stopped. In order for them to be stopped, they have to start. In order for them to start, they do need a red heifer going forward. But once they get the red heifer and they get that concoction, then all of these things can play out. And then you're going to be looking. Will someone pop up and say, hey, I'm Christ? Start doing miracles? But again, 5,783 years. And it looks like we're 217 years old. The scholars agree that this is off by 200 or more years. Very unsettling. If this is off by 200 or more years, what does that mean? That puts you over 6,000. The number's off. You don't know when, but maybe things are closer than you thought. Why are we seeing these red heifers? How come they have all of these things ready and the land bought? I mean, is it time? I don't know. But you know what we're looking for. There are no sacrifices that have been stopped. There are no sacrifices that have started. But all of this other stuff make you a little unnerved. So again, it's not 5,783, but it's short, 200 years or more. Nobody knows what it is. So, what would make the Jews start doing sacrifices? Let's say some guy did come and say, hey, I'm Christ, and he called fire down from heaven. The Jews believe they're waiting for the Messiah. In order for the Messiah to come, Elijah has to come first. The only other person that ever called fire down from heaven was Elijah. This dude shows up and starts calling fire down from heaven. They're like, okay, it's time. That's Elijah. Now, granted, he's going to do an okey doke and turn around and come and just destroy everything. When he gets to Israel, abomination of desolation. Now, please keep in mind, a lot of the churches think something different. Some churches believe you just trust in God and then you just wait to see what happens. You have other people that go, during that point when the sacrifices start, before they stop, that 45 days, you're supposed to run. Where? To the place of safety. Well, where's that? Some people believe you're supposed to go to Jerusalem. Other people will go, why go to Jerusalem? Christ said, don't come into Jerusalem. And then you'll have others go, well, he says those in Jerusalem to leave. Did Christ not know that he would have worldwide followers? Why is he telling only people in Jerusalem to leave? Well, where do you go if you're in New York? And again, I'm just telling you all the different things out there. But some people will go, during that 45 days, you're supposed to run to Jerusalem, and then from Jerusalem, you run to the places that they will use scriptures to try to support that and say, oh, look, we're supposed to gather together. Gather together, we got to run away. Others will go, don't do that. And you're going to have these two different schools of thought. All I say is do what you're supposed to do, and you'll have the wisdom to understand it. Because it's going to get nasty, and it'll turn into something. And after that 45 days, once the beast power then goes into the Jerusalem, destroys it, and an edict is given, whatever that edict is. I don't know what an edict is if it's on your hand and on your forehead, but whatever that edict is, you won't be able to work and participate in the society unless you are plugged in. And you want to turn around and say, I'm a Sabbath keeper in that kind of environment that believes this man is God and that is promoting this Catholic type regime, and you didn't run away, what's going to happen to you? Are you going to get caught in it? Are there people that are sequestered? Are there people that are left? I don't know. Speculation. But it poses questions. And so, we end with Matthew 24, verse 42. Matthew 24, verse 42. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come.